Hello you all, and welcome back to Living Unveiled with Maddie. In the last few episodes, we have been dealing with the conscience, what it is, how it functions, and what happens when it is repeatedly ignored. But there is another side to that conversation that we now need to confront carefully. Because once inward governance weakens, external governance naturally increases. A life will always be governed by something. That is the part many people miss. Human beings were never designed to exist without leadership, influence, or direction. The question has never been whether man will be led. The real question has always been by what? And not long ago, I found myself reflecting deeply on something the Lord began to highlight repeatedly before me. Control. Not discipline, order, or structure, but control as the persistent human desire to secure outcomes, manage uncertainty, direct behavior, and ultimately reduce human dependence on God. And once I began noticing it, I started seeing traces of it everywhere, within systems, institutions, culture, politics, economics, relationships, and even within the church. I remember counseling a friend once who genuinely had a valid reason for missing a midweek service. There was nothing rebellious about it, nothing careless. When a pastor called to ask why she was absent, she panicked and lied that she was sick. And honestly, if you had seen her that day, you would have thought someone was pulling her with invisible strings. The fear was disproportionate to the situation. What struck me afterwards was not merely the dishonesty, it was what sat underneath it. Why did honesty suddenly feel unsafe? Why did a simple conversation trigger fear strong enough to override truth? And that was when I began thinking more seriously about the nature of control. Not loud control, but subtle control. The kind that slowly conditions people to respond out of fear instead of inward conviction. And when I began tracing the pattern through scripture, something became very clear. Control was never God's original framework for humanity. Surrender was. In Genesis 2, Adam is given responsibility, authority, and access, but all of it functions within surrendered dependence on God. He's not autonomous, he's not self-governing outside divine leadership. His life functions through relationship, instruction, and trust. And then arrive at Genesis 3, and the serpent introduces an entirely different framework. You will be like God, knowing good and evil. That was not merely temptation to sin, rather it was an invitation into self-governance. Define reality for yourself, determine truth for yourself, take the reins for yourself. That was the real fracture point in Eden. And from that moment onward, humanity began progressively moving from surrendered dependence towards systems of control. Sometimes political, economic, religious, or even technological, but the underlying impulse remains the same. Control always seeks to hold the reins. Now, this becomes important because control never remains isolated. It develops in stages. Control leads to manipulation. Because once control becomes the objective, influence becomes necessary. Perception must be shaped, responses must be managed, behavior must be guided. And manipulation, when fully matured, eventually leads to destruction. That progression is already established biblically. In John 10:10, Jesus said, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy." That is the trajectory. Not merely inconvenience or merely disorder, but destruction. Now, compare that with God's pattern. In Proverbs 3:5-6, scripture says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him and He will direct your path." Notice the language carefully. He will direct your path. That is leadership without manipulation. That is surrender without oppression. And that distinction matters because modern culture often treats surrender and control as though they were parallel, but they are not. Control manipulates in order to dominate and eventually destroy. God leads in order to align and empower. One diminishes freedom, the other restores it. And that's why 2 Corinthians 3 verse 17 says, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. True surrender to God does not produce bondage. Rather, it produces alignment, clarity, discernment, and life. Now let's bring this into the world that we are entering. The struggle for power today is no longer merely territorial. Increasingly, it is informational and behavioral. Whoever controls the big data can influence perception. Whoever understands patterns can shape behavior. And whoever predicts appetite can guide outcomes. This is not theory, because entire industries now function around behavioral prediction and engagement engineering. Systems today track attention, habits, preferences, emotional responses, movement patterns, purchasing behavior. And over time, those systems become increasingly precise. And the issue here is not that artificial intelligence exists, because it does exist. But artificial intelligence is not competing with supernatural intelligence. Artificial intelligence is created by man. Supernatural intelligence originates from God himself. That distinction must remain clear. In 1 Corinthians 2, verse 11 to 12, Paul writes, for who knows a person's thoughts except the spirit of that person, which is in him? So also no one comprehends the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. Now we have received the Spirit who is from God, that we might understand the things freely given us by God. That is supernatural intelligence. Not merely the processing of information, but divine illumination. And supernatural intelligence does not govern externally through coercion, behavioral engineering, or manipulation. It leads internally through surrender, discernment, conviction, wisdom, and truth. That is why Romans 8:14 says, for as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. And Isaiah 30 verse 21 says, your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. That is inward leadership and governance, not striving or manipulation or forced compliance. Now let's compare this with artificial systems. Artificial intelligence, functions externally. It studies pattern, predicts responses, and reinforces behavior through exposure and repetition. And at first, people assume they remain fully in control because the interaction feels voluntary and beneficial. But over time, the integration becomes increasingly seamless because repeated interaction begins shaping instinct, appetite, attention, emotional response, and eventually judgment itself. And this is where the conscience becomes critical again, because the eruption of conscience does not produce neutrality. It gradually transfers the government of a life from inward conviction to outward influence. A healthy conscience resists manipulation. A weakened conscience absorbs influence more easily. That's why scripture warns in Ephesians 4:18 that people can become darkened in their understanding. Once inward discernment weakens, external systems encounter less resistance. And this is why surrender matters so deeply. Surrender is not weakness. Surrender is how the reins of a life remain under the government of God rather than under the increasing influence of externally engineered systems. So ultimately, this conversation is not merely about technology, it's about governance. Who governs the inward life? Because every life will eventually surrender to its reins to something. Is it truth, appetite, fear, culture, systems, ambition, or even God? There is no truly ungoverned life. And the danger of this generation is not merely technological advancement. It is the possibility of increasing external sophistication alongside decreasing inward discernment. Because once people lose responsiveness to truth internally, they become increasingly vulnerable to external control. And that is why now more than ever, believers must remain spiritually sensitive, internally governed, and led by the Spirit of God as children of God as we prepare for the return of the bridegroom. Until next time, stay unveiled.